So one of the economic services that we have with trees is the harvesting of trees. And so we're going to talk about some different ways that trees can be harvested and which ones are the best way to preserve biodiversity. So one way is through selective cutting. The nice thing about selective cutting is what you're seeing here is on a steeper hillside. You'll see the road that they cut in here to be able to get to all the trees. But down here at the bottom, you'll see that there's a waterway. You'll see that they left a buffer strip in this area. So they left trees and vegetation to catch any of that sediment that might erode away off of the hillside. And then they didn't cut down every single tree. They only took specific trees and then they left other trees. What that'll do is a couple of things. One is it reduces fire hazards in the area because they're no longer so densely packed. It allows the trees that are remaining to get bigger, taller, to grow straighter, which makes it more valuable timber for them later on. And it also leaves some cover for the ground cover so that the water's not directly hitting the soil and causing massive amounts of erosion. So selective cutting is a really good option for areas where they still need to harvest, but they don't want to harvest everything and they want to still protect what's left behind. Clear cutting obviously does not protect what's left behind. You can see they didn't leave that buffer strip. The water is no longer blue. Now it's very sedimented, which then increases the water temperature. It decreases the depth, which then impacts the species that live there. This kind of cutting is what they used to do in the Pacific Northwest, and it's really, really hard for areas to recover. Because the slopes are so steep, it's really hard for soil to get established and to stay in place to allow anything to grow back in order to let the hillside recover from that. Another way is called strip cutting, and in strip cutting what they do is they leave vegetation, but then they will cut everything, so they basically like clear cut in strips, and then leave the rest of it behind, and then they put it into a rotation. So what you see is an area that hasn't been cut, the most recent harvest, it's been cut a few years ago, still leaving that buffer and still protecting their stream. So in this area, what you can see is most likely a property line along here, and then the effects that clear cutting can have. So all these roads that are in here were all skid trails. They were ways that they were getting the timber out of areas. They have little landings, so they would skid the trees to certain landings, and then they bring in the bigger trucks in order to pull them all out. So the advantages of clear cutting, there are some advantages because you get lots of timber all at once. It takes less skill because you're cutting out everything, so you don't have to worry about breaking the other things that are still around there. If you can get an area that's flatter when you clear cut, and you can get some faster growing trees and things like that in there, it's not quite so bad. It's on those steeper slopes where it's really, really hard on the environment. So we've talked about some of those disadvantages, and basically it's that disruption of the ecosystem and the ecosystem processes that are going in those areas, and then all those ecosystem services that are good about forests are now gone because the forest is gone. Some areas that we talked about. The large openings can be a good news, bad news sort of thing. So you've got large openings for predators who need to be able to hunt, and that's where their prey will go to. But then on the prey side of things, you've got big openings. So it kind of goes back and forth. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. So I always really like to look at it as well, what can we do about it then? Instead of just saying, well, what we're doing is wrong, well, what can we do that's a little bit different? And so some of it's about looking at the economic value and the ecological value. So valuing both sides of things and not just that I can harvest the timber of an area. And then it's also that eye to sustainability where we're not going to harvest faster than the trees will grow. So we want to put things into rotation or use selective tree cutting. And so we're leaving some of that resource behind and then protecting those areas that are vulnerable, like old growth forests or like stream corridors, those riparian areas that are really difficult, excuse me, to recover. So a lot of it's just having a little bit longer view about how do we get the wood that we want and the materials that we want out of the forest while still protecting the ecosystem. And that's what we're primarily focusing on. We want to stop taking every single thing out of an area. We want to start to look at what can we do with things like selective tree cutting or strip cutting that would be a little bit more would be a little bit easier on the environment and still get us the things that we want. When we look at forests, we also have to deal with some of the natural catastrophic things that can happen in forests as well. And forest fires are a natural process in our forests. Some of the forest fires obviously are started by lightning, some are started by human beings, but no matter what, there are some benefits from fire being in ecosystems. Many of our forests evolved, the trees evolved with fire in there. So our ponderosa pine forests up in the northern part of our state evolved with fires. They evolved with a fire frequency of about 5 to 10 years. That's why ponderosa pine has such a thick bark on it, because it makes it fire resistant. But what they're resistant to are low frequent fires that happen along the surface of the ground. Back before European settlement came out here, our forests look very different. If you go up there now, you'll see that they're very close together, lots of little trees and things like that, because we have, for the past 100 years, suppressed fires in our ecosystems. But before we got here, fires happened much more frequently, and so our forests up in northern Arizona looked much more like parks. We have pictures from the turn of the 1900s when people started coming out here, and what it looked like. It looked very, very different than it did now. The frequent fires would kill a lot of the little seedlings, which would allow the bigger trees to get bigger, and so you had big open areas with grass underneath it, and you had big tall trees in areas. So it can remove those frequent fires can remove some of that flammable material from the ground. It removes what we call the fire ladders, which are where lots of stuff fall down and dead, and they build up, and then they can burn up into the canopies, because when that happens, that's where we get these giant stand replacing catastrophic fires, which is not what our ecosystem here in Arizona had evolved with. Ours evolved more like the picture on the left hand side here. There are some areas, though, like Yellowstone, that evolved with the catastrophic stand replacing fires. And so in the 1980s, when the big wildfire happened there, it did exactly what nature does. You have aspen come in, and then you have some of your lodgepole pine and your jack pine and things like that coming behind it, followed by spruce and fir. And as all you go through succession there, the end of succession for the Yellowstone area is giant fires that happen there, usually lightning started, which is what happened in this case. They were started by lightning, they were put out by snow around Thanksgiving time. We herded them around buildings and things like that we placed value on, but people didn't put out the big Yellowstone fires in the 1980s. Nature started them, and nature put them out. So we have to think not just from our view of what we want the forest to look like and how we want the forest to behave, but also think about those natural processes that have been occurring for a longer period of time than we've been here. So obviously setting fires is a controversial thing. People get a little bit scared about us setting fires, but we have suppressed fires for so long that the only way we can get that natural fire cycle restarted is to go out and burn areas now. Generally they try to do them on days where it's not windy, and they can do it in a controlled circumstance when it's not as hot out. We don't like to do them in the summertime when we have our bigger fires anyhow. We want to do them in the fall or in the spring when we can control the fire a little bit more. And so they're going to clear out those areas, and we're going to bring ourselves back into the natural cycle. But some other things that need to happen is that people need to understand that they have to take care of their property. So they need to make sure that they are having a defensible space around their property where the fire isn't going to come straight into their homes. So the Healthy Forest Restoration Act was allowing companies to come in and cut down some of the trees in there because we had taken harvesting out for about 15 years and said, nope, you can't harvest anything in northern Arizona. What we realized then was that we were building up all these fuels on the ground, which led to the giant fires. And so this is what the Healthy Forest Restoration Act was, is that they could come in and cut those trees, but they also had to go in and take out, and they had to thin forests basically on our national forests. And that they could remove some of that slash and some of those ladder fuels. Logging is always going to be a debate. It always is. The thing about national forests is that they are multiple use, and that is their designation. So they're not just for timber harvesting, they're not just for recreation, they're not just there for everything. And so we had to figure out ways in order to allow for economic use of the forest as well as recreational use of the forest, and finding those common grounds where we can use our forests for all those multiple uses and still meet the needs of the forest and allow for some thinning and things like that and jobs and that economic development. So one of the ways to help with our issue about deforestation is to cut down the demand for trees. And so they're looking for other kinds of things that they could grow that could be a replacement. And so this is kenaf, and it's a kind of like a bamboo-y like sort of thing that can be used. It grows super fast. Stands like this grow like in a year or two, and they can use them to make paper and charcoal and things like that. So we're not having to use trees that take 30 to 40 years to grow. We can use something like this instead. So some of it is also the tree plantations are also helping out. We talked about these a little bit already. Tree plantations like we have down in the southern part of the United States, if we can sell them and if we can use them and make a profit off of them, and we can still get all the timber that we need out of them, then there's no need to cut the old growth because we're already doing this. So that's a place where government and industry have to kind of come together and help to promote, like, this is what's good business practice, and it's also good for the environment. Because what it can lead to is our deforestation. And I know you've probably been hearing about tropical deforestation for long periods of time. It's a little bit different to see some of the pictures in an area where there was all just forested area, and now this is an area that's all been slashed and burned. And you see the roads coming through and the little spokes coming out in those areas. So when we talk about the tropical deforestation, well, what does it matter? And that's because it's like a pharmacy out there. We don't know all the stuff that's in the tropical rainforest. We haven't discovered all the plants. We don't know all of their uses. And so if we cut them all down, there's already cures for things that we've gotten out of the forests, things like for malaria. And when you think about even just on a closer level, willow bark is where we got aspirin from. I mean, so there's lots of things out there that are very useful for us that if we cut it all down, we just don't know what we're going to be missing. We have some influence over there. We have some primary and secondary causes of why deforestation is happening, especially in tropical areas, which tend to be our higher areas of higher poverty. And when we look at all of those reasons why there's the deforestation that's occurring, we have exponential population growth, people living in high poverty, governments who are looking at feeding their people as opposed to protecting their environmental resources. And then how do we actually feed into that? And I want you to kind of look at this, and that's part of what's in your notes, is how do we influence this whole process? And then some things that we can do. What can we do about that? We can look at how do we protect those areas? How do we educate? How do we encourage? How do we help people get out of poverty so that this isn't their only way of supporting themselves? And then how do we restore areas that have been deforested? How can we go back in, and how can we try to replace some of those things and go through some reconciliation ecology and figure out how can we fix some of the problems? We have, once again, some people who have been important in that. And this nice lady here, she took people out, there were poor women out, and she started planting trees with them. And so that they would have those trees so they could harvest and still have a sustainable source of fuel wood. So they could heat their water, so they could have water that didn't make them sick. And then they could still do what they needed to do, but they could also protect the environment.